welcome everyone. Welcome to the University of Melbourne and welcome to the Australia-India Institute. We acknowledge that we are on the land of the Wurundjeri people who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years. Welcome in particular to a lot of our guests. I'd like to welcome some distinguished guests. We have the Governor of Bengal, Mr. M.K. Narayanan here, and Mrs. Narayanan. Welcome to both of you. Welcome to Australia for the first time. I'd also like to welcome the High Commissioner for India in Australia, Mr. Biren Naidoo. He has been a great supporter for the Institute. And welcome too to the Consul General for Victoria, Dr. Subhakanta Bahara and Mrs. Bahara. Thank you very much for coming again tonight. We have a lot of distinguished visitors from in particular from India, and I don't have time to go through all of you. So thank you all very much for coming. I know many of you have, this will be your first time in Australia. So I hope you do take the chance to get out and see our beautiful city and enjoy our country. I'd also like to welcome and thank our sponsors. The Australia-India Institute is supported by the Australian Government and by the Victorian Government. So thank both of you for supporting our work. And this conference and today's activities have been supported by a number of sponsors whose names were on the list on the screen a while ago, but a number of Victorian universities and other people. So you'll see their names on the program, so thank you all very much for coming and for your help tonight. This is the opening event of our conference entitled The Argumentative Indian. I hope all of you can join us for at least part of the conference, which will start in here tomorrow morning and go until about 7 o'clock on Friday evening. It is a packed conference. We've got some fantastic speakers. In fact, Amitabh assures me that this is the most significant conference on India being held anywhere in the world this year. The title of our conference is the title of the famous book by Professor Amartya Sen. Professor Sen is a Nobel laureate for economics, and currently he's a professor of economics and philosophy at Harvard University. In the calculating, even sometimes brutal world of economics, he is a voice of humanism. And he's worked on issues of famine, on welfare economics, poverty, gender inequality, and he's been a great seminal thinker in these topics for many years. And he has provided a welcome to this conference, which we'll now see.
Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this conference, to this wonderful conference. I have seen the program and I wish I could be there. I feel a bit of an imposter that I'm welcoming people to a conference at which I'm not going to be present, but it's really my loss. I've often thought about trying to relocate Australia a bit closer to the northern hemisphere, which would make it easier for us to go there. So many exciting things happening. But at least I get the pleasure of inviting you all to this conference. I've been told that I should particularly mention, and I'm delighted to do so, Governor Alex Chernoff, Vice-Chancellor Glyn Davis, Professor Robert Johansson, and Professor Amitabh Mattu, who actually has been very involved in planning this conference. And I'm delighted to add my voice to those of others in welcoming everyone. I see that a number of people there who are old friends. Gopal Gandhi, a very old friend, who used to be the governor of West Bengal. In fact, his successor, M.K. Narayanan, is also going to be there. A number of other names I see among friends like Pratap Bhanu Mehta and others. I won't mention everyone by name, there are quite a few. And I really feel very sad not to be there. I should really not be having this role because I'm not giving a paper in the conference, but the conference does share the name of a book of mine, namely The Argumentative Indian, and I'm honored by it. I've been told to say something about the book, describe its main content, but if it's arrogant to write a book, it's super arrogant to try to describe it to others. So I won't really do that, but I think the subject of arguments in India is a very important one. India had a very long argumentative tradition with which my book is much involved. I even begin with the Rig Vedas, quoting a rather agnostic, possibly even atheistic verse in that 1500 BC document, which is meant to be the mainstay of the Hindu religion. But this is a tradition to which not only the Hindus but also Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Parsis, and even people of Jewish origin, who all came to India at different times, have contributed. I think we should celebrate that, especially since from time to time intolerance appeals to some countrymen of mine, and I think it's very important to avoid that thought. I think it's also an invitation to think about the tradition, an invitation to take a critical view of it. If you think about the Gita, which is one of the scriptural books in Hinduism, it's really one long argument between two perspectives about whether it's right to wage a war and in the process kill people, kill even people who are close to one, friends, relations, and so on, in pursuit of a good cause. Krishna taking the view that that is your duty, you ought to do it. Arjuna taking the view, the great warrior, that it may look like my duty, but could it be my duty really to kill all these people, even if the cause is good? In the Gita itself, Krishna wins the argument, but if you look at the epic, and that's where the criticality comes in, some of the things that Arjuna worst feared, namely the kind of death and desolation that visits the area. The Mahabharata, the epic ends with funeral fires burning at different places, women crying about the men who had died. It's not a story where the celebration of the Krishna perspective could be seen to be unalloyed. There is something to discuss, and that criticality is a very important one to capture. And it depends on, when we look at history, we can interpret it in different ways. I've always emphasized, and maybe a personal bias there, to look at the critical elements in it because they give us interesting things to think about today, and I think that applies to many areas in Indian thought today. I think it's also the case that the long argumentative tradition has some contribution to make to having a flourishing democracy in India. So in that sense, there is something to explore, to what extent this helps our democracy. Our democracy is successful in many ways, not in every way, because a lot of the people do not get an adequate voice. People who are in the bottom of the society, the contrast between the privileged and the rest can be quite large. And it's an incitement also to think about the argumentative tradition, is to how to bring more people into the fold of the effective arguments in the Indian polity and I know many people here in this conference, I see from the name, have really thought about that issue. And these are important issues. So the argumentative tradition in India to think about it is partly a celebration, partly an invitation to criticality, partly a reason for further exploration, and partly also incitement to get more people into the argument so that the Indian democracy could be a more inclusive one than it has in effect ended up being. I have to confess that I'm at the moment finishing a book jointly with Jean Drèze, tentatively called An Uncertain Glory. That's a Shakespearean term from Two Gentlemen in Verona, An Uncertain Glory, India and its contradictions. I think these contradictions are part of the Indian society, and I think the argumentative tradition can be invoked in the context of trying to resolve these contradictions as well as to understand these contradictions much better. So this is, to me, a huge intellectual invitation that the Indian argumentative tradition presents to us. And this conference, in many ways, is something that I really admire the planning of, because there's so many interesting issues that are being captured in the different sessions. I feel very deprived not to be able to come and attend, and in some ways giving the role of inviting others to come there without being able, or welcoming others to come there without being able to be there. It seems to be adding to, as they say in Bengali, adding salt to an injured skin. And it's sadness, but I wish you all a wonderful conference, and I will find out from Professor Mathur and others how it went. And I would very, very much like to express my appreciation in giving this opportunity to somehow indirectly participate in this conference. I'm very grateful, and I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful set of meetings. Thanks very much.
We're holding this conference a few days after the launch by the Prime Minister of the white paper Australia in the Asian Century, and a few weeks since she launched Ozfest in Delhi. I hope our visitors in particular will get a chance to read the document. The white paper is a call to action for Australia and Australians to reach out and engage with the Indo-Pacific. It is in many ways an aspirational document, sketching the kinds of changes needed if we are to realise the opportunities proffered by the shift in global economic power. But in other ways, it also reflects the profound changes that have already occurred in Australia. Changes that began 50 years ago when we began dismantling the barriers in trade, in race, in outlook, when shortly after World War II, we began trading with our then recent enemy, Japan. And they were barriers that had been erected really at Federation, when as a matter of public policy, we chose to define Australia in a particular way. So it is, so the white paper is in a way a public, it's a sort of stage in a public debate where the contention, and really there's not much contention, is about how to do it rather than why or if we should do it. Tonight, to talk about these issues of public policy and debate in the Australian India Institute annual oration, I'm delighted to welcome the lecturer, the Vice-Chancellor of this university, Professor Glyn Davis. Professor Davis has been Vice-Chancellor here since 2005, and he's a Professor of Political Science. Previously, he was Vice-Chancellor at Griffith University, and he was, prior to that, Director General of the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Queensland. He's been a Boyer lecturer, he's chairman of Universities Australia, and he has a range of publications and background that I won't go further about. But suffice to say, I think that under his leadership, this university has in those 7 years been transformed, and it is now ranked in the top 30 in the world on a number of the rankings. So it's my very great pleasure and honour to invite Professor Davis to address us tonight.
Thank you. Robert, thank you very much. It's a very generous welcome. Can I join you in acknowledging the Governor of West Bengal and the High Commissioner and the Consul General and so many distinguished guests? And can I now talk about the degree of difficulty? Because that brilliant video you've just seen from Amartya Sen sets out the theme that I'm about to explore. And many of the references I use are directly drawn from his text, because I had a chance to read his text, and it is a superb distillation of his philosophy. And I was going to spend the next 25 minutes teasing out just one or two elements of a brilliant speech that you've just heard. It is in fact a great honour to be invited to deliver this inaugural Australia-India Institute oration, and indeed my notes say it's more than an honour, it's a truly frightening responsibility to speak after the presentation from one of the world's foremost contemporary public intellectuals. If you'd heard the speech, you'd have heard Amartya Sen explain that this conference, as Robert has just told us, is named for his very influential book, The Argumentative Indian, which provides both the title and the theme for the conference, which is why it's so important. And Professor Sen provides a brilliant, I think we can all agree, argument about why argument matters. And he starts with the story of Krishna and Arjan fighting over war versus peace and what this means, and the fact that this is done through an argument, and says, how else do we make choices? How else do we decide what matters? How do we make decisions as a community? Professor Sen then goes on, as you recall, to describe critical thinking as at the core of this, at the core of what he calls the democratic project. And I want to pick up just two words he uses in the way he describes this, which is public reasoning. And that's the theme I want to explore tonight. And I want to start with a man who will be instantly familiar to an Indian audience and perhaps less known to us. This is, of course, the great Bengali poet, Rabindranath Tagore, the most revered and famous poet of the 20th century in India, a man of significant influence far beyond the shores of India. And there's an important, famous personal connection between Amartya Sen and this poet, a connection we could have explored in more detail in different circumstances. But Professor Sen's grandfather was not only the Vice-Chancellor at Visvarati University in West Bengal, but he was a literary scholar in his own right and a very close associate of Tagore. And as Professor Sen so movingly tells the story, you'll recall, Tagore wrote to Professor Sen's pregnant mother, saying that he really disliked the tradition of naming babies after old family names, and that Tagore had invented a whole new name for the soon-to-be-born son, and he hoped that mother might like it and think of using it. And that name was Amartya, which is how Professor Sen got his first name. To be named by one of the great writers is a legacy very few can claim. To then live up to that legacy through a long life is an extraordinary responsibility, one that has been clearly achieved by Professor Sen. And I want to stay for a minute with this relationship between Tagore and Sen, because it sheds light on this idea of public reasoning. Tagore, of course, renowned poet, painter, novelist, musician, died in 1941, and Sen, late in life, explored his legacy in a very influential essay called Tagore and His India. As a poet, Tagore exerted significant influence on Western culture, particularly in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The British war poet Wilfred Owen, who was killed in the trenches in the very last days of the First World War, died with Tagore's words scrawled into his pocket notebook. And in 1920, his mother wrote to Tagore and said, Wilfred said goodbye with those wonderful words of yours, beginning of, when I go from hence, let this be my parting word. She was quoting from a poem that would have been very familiar to her generation and her son's generation, called Parting Words. When I go from hence, let this be my parting word, that what I have seen is unsurpassable. I have tasted the hidden honey of this lotus that expands on the ocean of light, and thus I am blessed. Let this be my parting word. In this playhouse of infinite forms, I have had my play, and here have I caught sight of him that is formless. My whole body, my limbs have thrilled with his touch, who is beyond touch. And if the end comes here, let it come. Let this be my parting word. You can easily imagine why someone in the trenches would seize that poem and hold it so close. Rabindranath Tagore was the first Indian and indeed the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he died aged 80 after a lifetime of speaking with the extraordinary words. He said, I'm about to step onto the boat that crosses to the festival of the wordless end. And to have a perfect quote as your last words is pretty seriously impressive. Those are words that are treasured still. They appear in the national anthems of India and Bangladesh, and in the poems, stories, lessons, and artworks that are still treasured. The key thing about Tagore was he liked a good argument. He was deeply argumentative. He disagreed with those around the question of the future of India who wanted to argue that India should return to its cultural roots and push away the legacy of the colonial power. His clear message was that the inheritance of colonial rule is just as important to India as its own traditions and its long-established culture. He believed strongly in respecting people and cultures different from his own. And let me quote from him, I am proud of my humanity when I can acknowledge the poets and the artists of other countries as my own. Let me feel with unalloyed gladness that all the great glories of man are mine. And therefore it hurts me deeply when the cry of rejection rings loud against the West in my country that Western education can only injure us. And these words are not just fanciful, they're a direct shot at Gandhi and an argument with Gandhi about what the appropriate future for India should be. Tagore disliked and distrusted ideology. He insisted on open debate, on genuine public discussion. He believed we don't take proposals on trust. The only question that he persistently asks, says Amartya Sen, is, and I quote, whether we have reason enough to want what is being proposed. And Sen concludes, important as history is, reasoning has to go far beyond the past. It's the sovereignty of reasoning, fearless reasoning and freedom that we find is Tagore's lasting voice. And in his magisterial work, The Idea of Justice, published in 2009, Sen draws directly on Tagore's fierce advocacy of public discussion, and he argues for the sovereignty of reason, achieved through what he calls public reasoning. Public reasoning assumes democracy, a community that reaches decisions after canvassing all the choices in open debate. And this is about much more than institutional democracy. It's not just about ballots and elections and parties and campaigns. Amartya Sen's vision of public reason expands this notion of a democratic realm. It draws on the tradition of Tagore, the debates of the ancients and recent philosophical and economic writing. For Professor Sen, democracy is government by discussion, based on political participation, dialogue and public interaction, as he just told us in the video. Public reasoning is the process by which people who do not share the same morality or political views find agreement on policy choices. And there is the conundrum for every democracy. How do you get people who do not share fundamental beliefs about the world to agree on the particular choices that you choose to take? Public reasoning, in Amartya Sen's conception, is the process by which democracies navigate difference, find agreement around policies when the people in the room do not share much else in common. And to do that, says Sen, you require tolerance above all else, a willingness to start from different viewpoints yet arrive at an acceptable consensus. And that consensus, expressed as law and public policy, is reached through debate. Public reasoning, as Professor Sen does say on the video, is an incitement to get more people into the argument. I think when we look at the broad histories of India and Australia, we find lots of examples of this public reasoning, and I want to just focus on two, one from India and one from Australia. I want to start with something that Professor Sen said in 1982 in a book review in the New York Review of Books. He wrote, and I quote, "No major famine has ever occurred in a functioning democracy with regular elections, opposition parties, basic freedom of speech and a relatively free media, even when the country is very poor and in a seriously adverse food situation." Now that's a big call. No famine ever occurs in a democracy, a functioning democracy. And Amartya Sen had a simple explanation for this argument, that when media holds government accountable, when famine stalks the land, government must respond. In an authoritarian country, he argued, governments can look the other way, but not so in a democracy when an unfettered media will report starvation. A free press, Sen tells us, contributes to human security by giving a voice to the vulnerable and the disadvantaged. That is an extraordinary claim. It's a claim that a whole society will swing its attention toward dealing with starvation if that is the subject of conversation and debate, pressed through the media, debated in the political process, and compared, as Sen was doing in that review, to what happened in the still then communist countries that existed in other places where authoritarian governments were prepared to ignore famine because it got in the way of their other priorities. And he's arguing that this is one of the fundamental virtues of Indian democracy. Indeed, the tradition of argument has been a feature of Indian democracy since independence was achieved on the 15th of August 1947. Of course, poverty and illiteracy were part of the India that was created in 1947. Large parts of the Indian population were unable to read or write. And in lots of other places, that was excuse enough for the military or some other authority to impose authoritarian rule. But not so in India, where more than 400 million people exercised their right to vote in the most recent national elections. This remarkable feature of Indian democracy over more than 60 years has been the capacity of political leaders to work in a democratic system and engage with people. And that requires a form of public reasoning. A public reasoning you can see in this 10 rupee note and all the others that look just like it. It carries script in English and 15 other languages, from Assami through to Urdu. Despite the nation's many languages, religions and traditions, the democratic achievement has been a culture of free speech, with a strong press and vigorous, wide-ranging public discussion. Now, such discussion, such public reasoning, is always a messy process. Leaders must provide plausible public arguments for policy decisions and defend those choices against claims of bias or unfairness. And that's a very big test of any democracy. In a nation with so many different religions, political leaders must find a way through to policy choices, even though they're dealing with people who hold clashing and often incommensurate worldviews, whose fundamental beliefs have to somehow find a path through to a set of choices. They must find public reasons for policy, reasons that can be accepted by all, even those whose own view would take them in a different direction. This is difficult, complex and slow. It has many reverses and dangers. Debate can be divisive. It can threaten social stability. Yet India has maintained this tradition of public reasoning, working with the help of a free and thriving media, including newspapers and cable television, and today, of course, online and social media. So the interesting thing is, what happened when this was challenged? What happened when that resolve for public debate happened in June 1975, when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency? At face value, the 21-month exercise of emergency powers by the central government was a reverse for the cause of democracy, yet it was followed by an astonishing resurgence of free comment through a much expanded media. There have long been newspapers in India. The first one, the Times of India, was founded in 1838, and it remains the largest circulation English language newspaper in the world, but it joins hundreds of other newspapers in many different languages every day published in India. Prime Minister Gandhi was not a fan of this or any other newspaper. She found the Indian press unhelpful for stable government. The night before India's state of emergency was announced on radio, the power supply was switched off to all Delhi newspaper offices. By decree, the government could censor newspaper and radio until the edict was lifted in January 1977. What's interesting is what happened next. In the subsequent election, the Congress Party was swept from office and Mrs. Gandhi lost her seat in Parliament. Her defeat sparked what Ram Gua has called India's newspaper revolution. Now, this was in part technological in origin. The arrival of offset printers and the ability to simultaneously print multiple editions of a paper in towns far apart suddenly arranged a new set of possibilities. But the sudden lifting of censorship also provided a great incentive to investigative journalism, and the spread of education through those decades added millions of people to the readership of all newspapers. And that vibrant press remains, most notably in recent decades through the subsequent spread of television. National television broadcast did not begin in India until 1982, and then with a single channel. It wasn't until the early 1990s that media law reform allowed other channels to arrive, and they arrive with spectacular speed. There are more than 500 channels and networks now broadcasting daily across India. And the competition for content to broadcast has become enormous. And so some of these channels, I can say with a bit of experience, are eerily reminiscent of their worst tabloid press. They're keen for sensational stories, they're patriotic, they're quick to find fault. And I say that with feeling because in 2009 a number of us had to go to India to explain what was happening in Melbourne with students, and we faced firsthand the Indian media, and it was a bracing experience. And that's what happens in a vibrant democracy. They were concerned about the fate of Indian students in this country. They had a series of tough questions. They were determined to press them, and they weren't going to be fobbed off with non-answers. It was exactly as robust public debate should be, although deeply scarring if you were standing in front of the cameras. For Amartya Sen, despite many imperfections, and he's got no illusions about the media, I hasten to add, the media remain central to public reasoning. Newspapers and television stations are the safeguard against famine. No democratic government fails to respond to human plight when the cameras are watching. Media play a vital role in allowing discussion in a nation where public choices have to speak across difference, regional, religious, cultural difference. And Amartya Sen has led by example, writing provocative articles for the popular press that are designed to draw attention to an issue. For example, his article claiming that 30 million Indian women are missing because of sex selection and neglect grabbed headlines across India, as it was designed to do. A memorable line, a memorable caption, drew attention to the plight of the disadvantaged and the neglected, and suddenly the cameras were watching. So Amartya Sen not only writes about media, he understands how to use it in order to draw attention. So let me think about public reasoning in Australia for a minute. Like India, the Australian nation is a product of British imperial history. Australia too, like India, is a democracy, though on a tiny scale by comparison. As in New Delhi, Australian cities host impressive British-inspired parliament houses and ceremonial links to a colonial heritage. And I was talking to the governor about wandering around Melbourne today and suggesting that it's always worth looking at the nearby Royal Exhibition Building, pictured, where the new Commonwealth Parliament convened on the 9th of May 1901. The early Australian democracy did not face the challenge of diversity found in India, and this was no accident. The nation was not built on multiplicity, but on a very narrow conception of citizenship defined in racial terms. From early on, British settlement in Australia intended that Australia be a European redoubt. A determination to exclude difference can be read in the policies toward the Indigenous, in policies to restrict immigration, in the masthead slogan of the Bulletin magazine, Australia for the White Man, in the exclusionary policies of the trade union movement, and even in the anti-Chinese racism in Ned Kelly's famous Jeroderi letter. The first national parliament that met in that glorious building passed the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, and that introduced the notorious dictation test, in which you could be excluded as a migrant if an immigration official chose to require you to respond in any European language that they deemed appropriate. This was legislation modelled on a bill from South Africa. It was the official statement of something informally called the White Australia policy, a very curious stance for a country located on the edge of Asia. One of that first Parliament's most capable leaders, and a University of Melbourne graduate and future Prime Minister, was Alfred Deakin. And his words captured much of the mood of the times. So, as Attorney-General, he introduced that Migration Restriction Act, and he told the House of Representatives in September 1901, and I quote, "At this early period in our history, we find ourselves confronted by difficulties which have not been occasioned by union, but to deal with which this union was established. No motive power operated more universally on this continent or in the beautiful island of Tasmania, and certainly no motive operated more powerfully in dissolving the technical and arbitrary political divisions which previously separated us than the desire that we should be one people and remain one people without the admixture of other races. It's not necessary to reflect upon them, even by implication. It's only necessary to say that they do not and cannot blend with us, and that we do not, cannot and ought not to blend with them." That's the Attorney-General of the country laying down the official policy of the country, fighting words from an Australian political leader who had travelled more than most and incidentally had spent significant time in India and wrote 2 books about India, including a fabulous book about irrigation in India, which Robert is the proud owner of a copy. This is a narrow democracy. This is a democracy based on a single culture, a culture determined to restrict difference. And if that sounds like the events of 1901, as late as 1988, an opposition leader could express reservations about Asian immigration. And I quote, "You've got to have a dominant culture," said John Howard. "Ours is Anglo-Saxon, our language, our literature, our institutions." But by 1988, John Howard was already speaking against the direction of Australian policy. Migration had widened significantly after the Second World War. The Colombo Plan had introduced new cultures to Australian citizens. In fact, in 1966, a new Migration Act removed race as the basis of selection for migration, and further amendments in 1973 confirmed that entry to Australia would be decided on character, not colour. But this was not an easy transition. It required the development of a new form of public reasoning, new ways of explaining who we are and of navigating the wider cultural differences within our society. And to his credit, this was a journey that John Howard embraced. His 1988 remarks contributed to his overthrow as party leader, and he spent a number of years reflecting and speaking about this experience. He would eventually regain that role and lead his party to victory. As Prime Minister from 1996, John Howard supported a migration policy that was firmly non-discriminatory in basis. During his long tenure as Prime Minister, he presided over a major change in source countries for Australian migration, with China becoming the largest source of new settlers to Australia and India fourth on that list. In 2002, I joined a business delegation that accompanied John Howard on his first ever visit to India. And I recall vividly his sense of discovery, astonishment at the scale and the energy of the India he encountered, and his enthusiasm for building the relationship. John Howard had glimpsed a nation that did not require a dominant culture, but could embrace difference as the basis of democracy. Not one centre, not one people, but many, defined by a political conversation with room for many voices. I suspect many Australians walked that same path with then Prime Minister Howard. It's as profound a journey as a country can take, because it goes to the core of who we are. It follows Tagore in seeking wisdom in traditions beyond our experience, in thinking globally, in people imagining themselves not in cultural or racial terms, but as citizens of a democracy strengthened through diversity. It's a tolerance that makes possible public reasoning. The journey evident in John Howard's lifetime and his career has been the experience of many Australians, an important shift in outlook reflected in our public conversations. Our political institutions are broadly those of 1901. The politicians of 1901 would recognise all of the institutions, the cabinet, the parliament, the parties. But I can't imagine the Parliament of 1901 embracing Ken Henry's white paper, Australia in the Asian Nation. It would have been just beyond comprehension in some literal sense. So what a transition from Alfred Deakin's lifetime. And an Asian focus is now self-evidently the future, and in fact the government is cropping criticism for not doing enough to integrate with our region, as fundamental an overturning of the earlier assumptions as possible. Thus do democracies change, through arguments and ideas, through challenges to existing assumptions, through the emergence of new possibilities. Public reasoning gives us the tools to remake our world. It allows us to build a more sophisticated democracy enriched by a wider contribution of views and beliefs. And in this, Australia has much to learn from India. Rabindranath Tagore was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1913, Amartya Sen in 1998. They represent very different traditions, the poet and the economist. Yet they share this passion about the rights of people to live and reason with dignity and freedom. In his poem, Gitanjali, Tagore sketched his vision for a world in which individuals can live the life they have reason to value, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit. Into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake. Like Professor Sen, Tagore here seeks a form of public reasoning and democracy. Institutions are a foundation, but he's arguing more is needed, and acceptance that debate and disagreement are essential parts of a culture that takes ideas seriously. In the video presentation, Professor Sen concluded by saying, "Our democracy is successful in many ways, but not in every way. A lot of people do not get an adequate voice, people who are at the bottom of society. The contradiction between the privileged and the rest can be quite large. The argumentative tradition incites us to think about how to bring people into the fold. And this is the essential argument for democracy, to hear all the voices, to make sure the camera is always on." and hence the results suggested by Professor Sen that famines do not occur in democracies because injustice has a chance of being heard. As much as Sen observed, democracies are not perfect. Sometimes the better argument loses. A people may not perceive their own best interests. They may be swept away by enthusiasm for the war of Krishna when the doubts of Arjun offered much wiser counsel. But in a world of multiplicity, public reasoning provides a way to navigate differences, explore options, make decisions that can withstand scrutiny. It's the basis of a large and successful society that lives with and draws strength from every tradition. Public reasoning and all it makes possible is why we need, and this conference will celebrate, the argumentative Indian. Thank you.
Now we have time for 15 minutes or so of questions or comments, and I'd invite some from the audience. Perhaps we have some microphones, and there's one here. Perhaps you'd say who you are.
My name's Peter Murrin. Last October, they had the CHOGM conference in Perth and I was actually in India for 5 months at that time, so I didn't know the thing behind it there and that. But I heard the Indian Prime Minister didn't come to this conference, and I'm just wondering what's the purpose of the Commonwealth Club now? Or is it just a big boys club there just to reminisce about old times, or what's the relevance for today though on it? What was his reason for not coming here and that, you know, with our Prime Minister trying to make relationships between India and that there and that, you know?
Peter, it stretches my memory. I think I recall that it was the argument about the sale of uranium, the willingness of the Australian government to sell uranium, that was the reason for not coming to Australia. It was a protest about a then decision by the Labor Party conference not to allow that sale, a decision I noticed was recently overturned. I can't tell you reliably what the Commonwealth ministers do when they get together. I'm sure they do something incredibly useful. Robert mentioned in a previous life I was the head of the Premier's Department in Queensland, and we spent a year organising a CHOGM meeting to be held in Queensland in 2001. And so I learned an awful lot about the inside arrangements of CHOGM. I learned a hell of a lot about how you organise a royal visit to a state, and we finally had everything lined up, and we were due to start on the 14th of September 2001. Terrible things happened in New York and Pennsylvania, and the CHOGM was cancelled. But the enduring memory I took from that was we spent a lot of time on arrangements and very little talking about the agenda. So I still don't know what they do at CHOGM.
So a question here.
Thanks. My name's David. Is it on?
Yes, if you start talking that.
Yeah, my name's David Feith. I studied at the University of Melbourne in the 80s, and I did Indian studies, and at the time was able to study Sanskrit, and Bengali was also offered as a language of instruction. But I understand that since then, and this has been a trend throughout Australia, that the study of Asian languages has decreased terribly. And I'm just wondering now, in light of the recent white paper, whether you can tell us what the plans are for Melbourne University in regard to Asian languages, particularly Indian languages.
David, thank you for the question. And without doubt, the study of Asian languages has had a rough 30 years since you studied here. Sanskrit is not offered at the institution. Hindi is offered through La Trobe University in an agreement, and I understand there are 15 students enrolled at the moment in Hindi. That's extraordinary. The strong growth of the Indian community in Melbourne will revive Hindi studies in this city without doubt. There has been a move toward collaboration across institutions to deliver languages, because it's an efficient way of doing it. And one of the exciting questions many of us are pondering is the development of online learning opens up language teaching again in really exciting and quite different ways, and whether we have an opportunity now to deliver language in new and much more effective ways. What we've seen since the 1980s is the growth, unambiguously the growth of Mandarin studies, which is one of the largest and most popular languages at this institution, and a relative decline in Japanese and Bahasa and other languages of the region. And what I'm very much hoping to see out of the white paper is that there'll be a revival of language interests. That fundamentally starts in the schools, and the decline of Asian languages in schools is directly correlated, in my view, to the decline in universities. So the issue and the solution start. But I think there's universal agreement and certainly enthusiasm inside all universities to get this back centrepiece on the agenda.
Take one Neville Roach up the back, and then one.
And Neville was with me on that trip with John Howard in 2006, and Neville and I sat on the bus together each day, and Neville explained what we were seeing. It was great.
Thanks, Glenn. I was going to say that.
Sorry.
But I'd like to start by congratulating you on a brilliant address. And the next time I go to India, I want you to take me around and to see India through your eyes.
We know what you'll learn out of that. Yeah.
But I just had a feeling that you were perhaps a bit too generous to John Howard. And as you might know, I chaired the National Multicultural Advisory Council, and I'm credited with getting him to actually try to say the word multiculturalism. But in many ways, the road to Damascus took a long time to get there, and it didn't last very long. And if you listen to that famous statement of his, that, we decide who comes to this country and the manner in which of their coming, could have been said in the first parliament in 1901.
It probably was.
I'm a little bit surprised at the generosity of that. Full credit to him in the fact that he did make a journey, and also he performed exceptionally well on that trip to India. But don't you think that in some ways he set us back, and that we are still struggling to return to the momentum of those days, which multiculturalism really thriving, celebrated. 2001 was such a great contrast from 1901, and we celebrated diversity. And we are still not recovering. The new policy of asylum seekers, was something that we're going back to his approach. A number of issues like that makes me wonder whether his lasting contribution to Australia, and it is huge, wasn't actually taking us back.
No. Thank you. I'm not often accused of being too generous to John Howard, so I'll take that. Thank you. And as you say, he performed extremely well in that trip through India. I've never quite gotten over that reception we went to in Delhi, where we were all introduced to Mohammed Singh, the Prime Minister. I remember John Howard saying, "Prime Minister, this is Glenn Davis. He's the Vice-Chancellor of Monash," he said. And perhaps, I guess I'm not trying to speculate about John Howard's personal views, to which I have no better access than anybody else. And in a sense, they're not the story I'm trying to tell. I'm trying to say that the generation of which he is part oversaw what is unambiguously a fundamental shift in the Australian attitude toward migration. You're absolutely right to say that our woeful performance on asylum seekers undercuts and negates much of what was achieved in the main migration. I have no argument with that and have share that view with you passionately. But I can only think about the Australia I grew up in and the Australia that I now live in the span of 50 years. It's a very different country, and countries change because leaders are willing to change. And I think for many years we had political leaders who were actually a fair way in front of public opinion about changing migration. John Howard was not one of those. He was late to come to the discussion, but having come to it, in fairness, he used office, as his predecessors had, to go on expanding the diversity of our society. he didn't like the language of multiculturalism. Lots of people don't. I think you can run a reasonable critique of multiculturalism from many different perspectives, as long as you don't try and overturn the premise. And the premise is that we have to have a society in which people of different backgrounds and beliefs can live together and be respected for who they are, and not be demanded to conform to one type. And in fairness to him, that wasn't the approach he took through the policy. You can draw the counterexamples, the way they tried to shift in his time language to citizenship rather than multiculturalism, and the way we then had to endure posters of Simpson and his donkey as sort of exemplary Australians. But that's about trying to find a new language to say who we are, and trying to find something that we hold in common. But there's much in what you say, and I'll mull it if I may.
I'll take the next question from Governor Narayan.
It's not. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not so much a question as a comment, if you don't mind. Probably not it's not going to be a very popular one. I was struck by the reference to Mrs. Indira Gandhi and the emergency. But I think a little known story about that is, I think one of the greatest moments for democracy came when she decided to end the emergency and go in for elections.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, because I was very much around there, that she took that decision knowing full well that she was not going to win the election. I mean, I think Mr. Dua must be somewhere in the audience. I don't know if he's here. Yeah. I think he will bear me out. The general popular view was that she was told that she was going to win the election, and that's why she did. Certainly not. She didn't even ask the question whether, am I going to win the election or not? I think this was an aberration, perhaps, in the way she thought matters out. The bulk of the advisors' view was, let's postpone it. I think there are a lot more things to be done. But she decided that we will go in for the election. I think, in a sense, I think that was somebody who had probably reached the abyss and then decided to go back. To that extent, I think the democracy and reasoning, I think it fits in with that. I think she reasoned that democracy or sustaining democracy was more important than holding on to power. I just thought I might mention that point. Thank you.
Governor, thank you. Thank you, and I take that in spirit in which it's offered. It's actually quite hard from outside to read Indian political history and understand the nuance, and the account you just gave is repeated in most of the history books around the emergency. It implies that she called an election confident she could win, rather than called it because she was fundamentally seeking to return to the democratic norm. For those of us from outside, it's very hard to make an informed judgment about that, which is why I tried to describe events but not offer a commentary on them. But that was clearly, the resilience of Indian democracy is, I guess, the message that many of us take out from that experience. And thank you for that first-hand account.
Question here.
My name is Raj Kumar. I'm the Vice Chancellor of O.P. Jindal Global University. Yeah. It was a really inspiring lecture. I just wanted to draw upon the fact which you mentioned about Amartya Sen's argument about famine, and then related to the contemporary context. Now, of course, India democracy has taken deep inroads and deeply embedded into the civic and political culture within India. The larger issue that we are facing in India also is about the ability of democracy to actually deliver things for people. Yeah. So, for example, in more recent times, we have seen, a significant number of starvation deaths taking place in a number of Indian states. And these have been indeed reported and brought to the public domain. Yeah. And one of the challenges, or at least two of the challenges which we're facing, at least to institutionalize democracy, is the inability of a number of democratic institutions to respond to the governance challenge on the one hand, and the inability of the Indian state to institutionalize rule of law. And these two have resulted in a widening gap between the expectations of the Indian citizenry from the Indian state. So it will be useful for you to reflect upon that, even, let's say, comparing the Australian context.
Thank you. Raj, thank you very much for that. It would be foolish of me to try and buy into Indian experience, except to say the gap, the deficit you point to between promise and delivery, between government's expectations and what happens on the ground, is a universal experience in democracy rather than necessarily unique to Indian states. We have exactly the same arguments here, not around the same issues, but essentially we're forced to the same question. That famous slogan that politicians campaign in poetry and govern in prose, which has been attributed to almost every politician of the last century, I think nicely captures the idea that, like President Obama, you talk about hope and you go out with it, and then you confront the realities of governing in much constrained circumstances. And governing is never as romantic as talking about governing, and the differences are quite profound. The question around, is that fundamentally undermining to democracy? The answer must be yes, if people become cynical and form a view that the democratic system actually can't address their issues, and that a group of leaders are cynically enjoying power and making no effort to address the issues. So that is when, whether it's India, Australia or anywhere else, you encounter a major problem. But thank you for drawing attention to that, it's great. Amartya Sen, were he here, would have something to say on it.
I've got time for one more, so in the middle there.
You just talk and it picks it up. Yeah.
Hello. Yes, my name's John Miller, and I've had the pleasure in the 80s and 90s of going to India on 10 occasions, having two professional connections, accounting and then academia. But what I wanted to say to the people, the Australians that haven't been to India, we have so much in common. The Vice-Chancellor showed us the 10 rupee note, and there were some very prominent words in English. At my very first serious conference in India, there were 30 VIPs from the finance industry in this quite luxurious boardroom, and they said, John, it's great to have you here, but we're not speaking English because you're here. We're speaking English because the whole group of us can only really relate in English, which was very profound, because then I discovered that most of the professions with their professional journals in India are in fact published in English. So the opportunities for Australians to go to India are greatly simplified, not only by the democracy and not only by the institutions, the press being in English. Also, if you want to set up a company in India, the company law, the corporations law, is very identical both on the subcontinent and in this country. So I don't have a question, just to say going to India is a joy and the communication is quite simple. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think we'll bring the session to an end, but I'll invite the director of the Australia-India Institute, Professor Amitabh Mattoo, to wrap up.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll all agree that despite the technological difficulties, this has been a brilliant start to the conference. Professor Glyn Davis has made Amartya Sen's arguments come alive. We did not, Glenn, miss the video at all, but we'll try and play it again tomorrow morning. Thank you so much, and please join me in thanking him for this brilliant lecture. Thank you. In retrospect, if I had had access to Glyn's speech beforehand, we might have changed the title of the conference to The Argumentative Indian, but the Equally Argumentative Australian. But from my new discovery of Australia, I've also, through our chair, benefited from his large collection of volumes, discovered all the arguments and debates and dialogues that have shaped Australia over the century. In fact, my favorite example is often a person who is often thought of as an intellectual giant, a great jurist, Owen Dixon. Mr. Narayanan would remember him, who mediated between India and Pakistan to resolve the Kashmir dispute. And there's a new biography of Owen Dixon published recently by a Monash historian who had access to his private papers. And Dixon writes to his daughter from Delhi, saying, I just hope that I'd never have to visit this God-forsaken place again. And thank God for the White Australia policy. Otherwise, what would have happened to Melbourne? But Dixon would certainly not have recognized the Asian white paper. But it just tells you that arguments are shaped by circumstances, by debate, by discussion, by opportunities and challenges, and equally so for India as it is for Australia. And I suspect, finally, that a large number of people at the end of this conference might suspect that there is a conspiracy to move back the capital of India to Calcutta, or to Kolkata, as I say. The theme of the conference is based on Amartya Sen's book. We've celebrated Tagore's great Renaissance views. The opening lecture of the conference is going to be delivered by the present governor of West Bengal, and the valedictory session is going to be delivered, valedictory lecture is going to be delivered by the previous governor of West Bengal. So we are celebrating Bengal all over. But ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great privilege and an honor to have Professor Glenn Davis give us the annual oration, and for the chairman of the Australia-India Institute to chair this session. Thank you, Robert. May I also take this opportunity to thank our special guest, His Excellency M.K. Narayanan, the Governor of West Bengal, the former National Security Advisor, and a great intellectual giant, a great strategic thinker, His Excellency Biren Nanda, the High Commissioner of India in Australia, the Honorable Dr. S.K. Behra, Mrs. Behra, Mrs. Narayanan, and all our distinguished guests who have come from India and different parts of Australia and abroad. May I remind you that our conference begins tomorrow at sharp 9 o'clock, and we'll have, after that, the opening lecture by His Excellency M.K. Narayanan on India and Australia in a changing Asia, and that is going to be chaired by the Governor of Victoria, the Honorable Alex Chernoff, who is also the patron of the Australia-India Institute. So see you all tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and thank you, Glenn, once again.